Welcome to Rugby Uncovered. This week we spoke to Dominic. He's the head of communications at World Rugby.
Dom, pleasure to have you on. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
We'd like to have a look at the laws in general, very general thing. Obviously, seen what's going on in Australia and New Zealand, but this enforced break has given governing bodies of sport around the world the chance to look at themselves and their members. The question we've heard most often is, can certain amendments to the laws of rugby enhance the game?
I think that's a very good question, and I think you're absolutely right. What the COVID-19 pandemic has effectively forced sports to do, but also wider society, is look at the way we do things, question why we do things a certain way, and understand whether we can do things better, more efficiently. And that's certainly been the case with World Rugby relating to the laws as well. And I think there are probably two separate elements or work streams that are ongoing that will be of interest to your listeners. And one is obviously the existing closed law trials, which were taking place across competitions around the world up until the pandemic, obviously locked down rugby. And then, of course, there were the law trials that were developed as a response to COVID-19 from a position of evidence and research into the transmission risk in the sport as well. So it's been a fascinating period of time. And I guess as a sport, we're fortunate in the sense that because it is a contact sport, because there is a massive focus and prioritization of player welfare, we had a big bank of research and an already kind of a medical / game trends focus on the way the sport was being played. So we're able to mobilize pretty quickly to understand not just what could be done in the short term to assist the sport in coming back, and sort of 127 member unions or nations that sort of sit under umbrella worldwide, but also would there be any longer term benefits to some of those laws as well, whether they be in the area of player welfare enhancement, injury prevention, or indeed in game attractiveness.
If we can encourage more people to try the game where size and weight were to play a less significant role, I think you touched on that in a way. Speed and agility and athleticism, people who aren't even particularly interested in rugby have commented on this, that it's become something of a slugfest in the last couple of years.
Yeah, and I think the sport means different things to different people, and one of the beautiful things about the sport is that it is a sport essentially for shapes and sizes, and I think at its core we need to retain that, and front and centre to our thinking when we're going through the law review process, both in terms of the concepts that a specialist law review group looks at, but also in terms of what we'd like the spectacle to be, then that's very much part of the decision-making process, that it has to be a sport for all shapes and sizes. But at the same time, it needs to be a sport that's accessible, that's simple, that's safer and more enjoyable for participants. And that's very much, where we come up when we're looking at law review itself. And I think when we've taken the steps to look at the law trials that were in existence before the lockdown, they very much strike to some of those points that you've raised. So, Australian Super Rugby is restarting, and of course that features the 50-22 kick, which is where if you're the team in possession and you kick the ball from inside your own half, directly into touch inside the opponent's 22 or from inside their own 22 into the opponent's half, you will have to throw into the resultant line out. And of course, what that does is it opens up some space because it enables the back three to sit back a little bit more, creating more space in terms of a fractured defensive line. And when we trialled this in the Australian National Rugby Championship, it kind of created a more attacking kind of focus to the sport. And I think really, really interesting, the initial feedback from coaches, players and referees within that initial trial in Australia was that it did have a positive impact regarding opening up space on the field. So that's just one example. And the other one, to speak to your point, exactly that, for those who wouldn't necessarily be, aficionados of the scrum, another area that's being trialled in Super Rugby in Australia has come directly from our law trials that were being implemented before COVID, and that is the goal line dropout for the ball being held up over the line. And instead of a 5-meter scrum, there's that dropout ability. And of course, again, that opens, not only does it open up the field from a counter-attacking perspective, but also it, on average, is reducing, the time taken versus a scrum in that area from 1 minute 34 seconds down to less than 30 seconds. So, if you sort of add that up during a game, these are the sort of things that can make a difference to the spectacle.
Yeah, absolutely. We talked the other day, you and I, about single changes in laws of games. For example, the back pass in football, that has turned that game around almost unrecognizably. It's a much better game now, I think. The women's game in this country isn't relaunching in the autumn, but because it's at a similar stage now to that of the men's game in the mid-1990s, there's a lot of optimism among the squads in the Premier 15s and the Women's Championship, despite straitened finances. Yeah,
it's incredible. If you look at the growth of women's rugby, it's we will say it quite a lot, it's the single greatest opportunity to grow the sport globally. But at a community level and purely at a youth level, the old adage, where girls go, boys follow, is very much true. And if you look at participation rates within the sport, last year there was a 585,000 registered player increase in the women's game, which for the third year in a row was greater than the men's. So it's definitely the fastest growing area of the game. And that's largely down to some of those, marquee products like the Premiership in the UK, which has been phenomenal. The amount of talent, the quality of the games, the competitiveness has been fantastic. And for young people to be able to see, really good star role models playing at a high quality level in league rugby in England has been remarkable. Similarly for us as well, the HSBC World Rugby 7 Series plays a very similar role. And of course, next year we have this golden year for women's rugby with both the Olympic Games in Tokyo, touch wood, fingers crossed, everything is okay in that regard, and also the 2021 World Cup, the Women's World Cup in New Zealand. So, there's no doubt that next year will probably be the biggest ever year for women's rugby, and that's very exciting.
Yeah. Speaking of this country, the way in which the women's rugby pyramid has been set up has been amazingly thorough and meticulous. Is this type of model fairly typical in the leading rugby playing nations for women's rugby?
Yeah, I think it's a model structure. There's no doubt about that. The RFU investing significant sums, not just in terms of the competition, but also all of the infrastructure that surrounds that, in terms of promoting and developing leadership, female leaders, both from administration and coaching perspective, but then providing those kind of high performance pathways as well, which kind of mirror the men's to a certain degree. You are seeing that mirrored around the world in terms of 15s rugby, definitely. Beyond the Six Nations, beyond the Sanzar nations, you have some really, really interesting case studies with the rise of women's rugby in Japan, for example, the Fijian national team. And, it's a very, very competitive area. And I think we'll see, as a result of those structures being put in place, a more competitive World Cup next year, certainly compared to what was the most competitive World Cup to date, when it was in Ireland in 2017. So no, they're definitely a model in terms of the way they structure their their league program and the performance management of their players, considering they've come a long way from not having any paid professional players a couple of years ago. So they're very much they're kind of the gold standard for other unions to follow. And the good thing as well about women's rugby, in particular, and certainly from our experience through, our general manager for women's rugby, Katie Sadlier, and the work she's doing in implementing the women's plan, is that there's a far greater appetite and willingness to knowledge share and assist across unions. So the forums that we hold, the workshops, the courses, the leadership programs, the coaching programs, that kind of knowledge share from, say, an England to a Brazil, or a Wales to a Uruguay, that all makes a huge difference. And it doesn't happen to that extent in men's 15s rugby, where it's a little bit more guarded. So I think you'll find that there'll be a very, very quick acceleration of standard within those countries, without a shadow of a doubt.
Yeah, I was listening to Martina Navratilova last night, drawing the same parallels between women's and men's tennis. So it's interesting parallels. Yeah.
Yes, it's very interesting, isn't it? I mean, why there is that kind of ability to collaborate and knowledge share, whereas, in I suppose, very, very rigid men's structures over years and years and years, that hasn't been, is a fascinating, probably psychological point as well as a structural point. But it's certainly making a difference in rugby. There's no doubt about that.
I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that we found on Rugby Uncovered over the last 9 months that women are just better at talking than men. That's what it comes down to.
And that's great to hear. And I love the podcast, and listening to your interviews. There's been some fascinating accounts as well. So no, you're absolutely right. And I think at the moment as well for women's rugby, this is the era of women's rugby. And if you look at not just in terms of the participation growth, but also in the fan growth, and it's very. Sometimes it's hard to take yourself out of Northern Hemisphere kind of view on this, but the driver of the global fan base in rugby is effectively young women in emerging rugby nations accessing rugby for the first time via short form sevens content on digital platforms. And that's how they fall in love with it and become engaged, because it's fun, it's exciting, it's easy to understand, and it's accessible. So that's really incredible. If you look at the growth of the sport in the likes of India, China, Brazil, as I've referenced, Germany, and so on, this is where that introduction is coming from. A lot of them will not have seen 15s at all to begin with. It would have all been through that sevens. And of course, what's driven that in the background? The Olympic opportunity. And when we went, if you cast your minds back to 2009, when rugby was voted onto the Olympic programme, and we had the likes of Cheryl Soon, Humphrey Kenge, Jonah the late great Jonah Loma involved in that bid. It was the women's proposition that probably was the compelling factor in us getting onto the Olympic programme, and it certainly hasn't disappointed.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Dom, thanks so much. We're grateful again for having you on. We can't wait for hopefully September to come around and the women to get back on the pitch.
Absolutely, and like you, I'm a fan as well. I can't wait to, but thank you very much. Really enjoy listening to the podcast, and we'll speak soon.
So great to hear the bright outlook for the women's game. Excitement's definitely going to build as we approach September. Thank you so much for listening, and we will catch you next time.